Are you looking to make your own homemade pasta from scratch? Well, in this video, I'm gonna show you two main methods that both give you great results. The first method is the traditional method, which is entirely handmade. And the second method involves a food processor. Now the question is, which method gives you better pasta? And what are the pros and cons of each? Let's dive in. If you guys haven't already watched my full review on the Imperia pasta maker machine, then go watch that right now. But basically in that video, I did a full review on the Atlas 150 versus the Imperia and gave you guys my pros and cons of each machine and why I think the Imperia is a better buy. Well, after releasing that video, I got a lot of requests on how to make homemade pasta. And specifically, a lot of people were asking me if they had to do the traditional homemade method or if there was an easier way to make pasta at home. And the answer is yes, there is an easier way. You can use your food processor. When I was typing up those responses, naturally the follow-up question was, well, which method's better? Was it the traditional method using only your hands to make the dough, or using the food processor? Now, making pasta is a bit of a touchy subject. A lot of people will tell you that there's a specific way to make pasta. There's specific ingredients or flour to egg ratio or a specific flour that you have to use, yada, yada, yada. It's a very controversial subject. I'm here to tell you, do what makes you happy. If you like a specific pasta and the way that it tastes, whether that's the American style, the Italian style, or your own recipe, do it. Because at the end of the day, this is for you. So in this video, we're gonna touch on a couple different things. We're gonna talk about ingredients, different types of flours, whether it's all-purpose flour or double O flour. We're gonna talk about the type of eggs you should buy, olive oil, all those great things. I'm gonna share my basic recipe with you guys. It's a very simple recipe that's very rich and I feel isn't too eggy, but also really distinguishes things and, puts your homemade pasta ahead of the game, especially for the store-bought stuff. And then we're gonna dive into the traditional method using your hands to make the dough entirely and, obviously using the pasta maker. And then we'll also talk about the food processor method, the pros and cons of each method. And then lastly, I'll touch on storage and how you should handle the pasta after you made it and kind of like the shelf life and expiration date, quote unquote, how long you can expect to kind of, keep the pasta in your refrigerator or freezer before it's time to throw it out. Okay, the first thing is ingredients. Now let's talk about flour. Flour is a really touchy subject. Again, pasta is just really controversial. The first flour that most of us have at our local supermarkets or at home is all-purpose flour. And that's a great flour to use. By all means, if that's what you have, go for it. Now, the more traditional way to make pasta is with double O flour. It's almost like this really fine dust, and it's very rich, and it really does separate your pasta. I mean, if you had to compare all-purpose flour pasta with double O pasta, I can tell you that the double O pasta is delicious. It's definitely worth it if you can find it and if you can afford it, because it is a lot more expensive than the traditional all-purpose flour. Now, if you are gonna go with all-purpose flour, I highly recommend you buy it unbleached. Try to get it as natural and organic as possible within your budget. If this is the first time you're making pasta, there's no need to go buy the most expensive stuff. Buy what you can afford. Buy the cheapest thing in the supermarket and just kind of learn the process and test it out. Don't go out and buy some double O flour and then get really frustrated that it didn't work out and you had to throw it all away. If you are gonna get double O flour, check out Amazon. They oftentimes have really traditional and authentic Italian style flour specifically for pasta. Now let's talk about eggs. If you are doing all-purpose flour, and in this video I will be using all-purpose unbleached flour, I highly recommend you add anywhere between 4 to 5 whole eggs. My recipe calls for 4 cups of flour to 5 cups of eggs, whole eggs. And the reason for that is, at our house, we usually have a pasta or an Italian meal at least once, if not twice a week. So I like to keep extra pasta dough in the freezer ready to go for, another meal. So for me, it makes more sense to make more pasta up front and, freeze it or store it than it is to just make, what I need for that day, or maybe 2 days, and that's it. A lot of people will tell you to go ahead and do 2 cups to 3 eggs. That's entirely up to you. And I've also seen some recipes calling for 2 cups and 5 or 6 eggs. Again, there's no right or wrong way to make pasta. It's entirely up to you, but the more eggs that you do add to the flour, the richer the flour is going to taste, the more protein that you have in the flour, the more fatty it's going to taste, and the more eggy it's going to taste. So if you like that, add more eggs. If you don't, then scale back the eggs. Some people will tell you to just add some egg whites or a blend of egg whites and yolk. I get it. That's their special recipe, and that's entirely fine. Now, if you're using the traditional 00 flour, which is naturally really fine and rich in proteins, you can scale back the eggs by 1 or 2 eggs. I don't think you need as much eggs into the flour because it's already really rich. If you're gonna do 4 cups of 00, do 4 cups of flour and maybe 4 eggs. Try that out. You can always add another egg, but by hand, it is a little bit more difficult to add the egg. It's not impossible, it's just gonna be a little bit more messier. Now, the next thing that you're gonna need is salt. It's really important to salt your pasta when you're making the dough. And it's also important to salt the water when you put the pasta in. If you don't add the appropriate amount of salt while you're making the dough, it's gonna require a ton of salt when it goes into the water. And then you're really gonna have a really hard time gauging how much salt you're gonna need. So I highly recommend that you buy kosher salt. And if you don't know what kosher salt is, it's the salt that you use to season your meat. It's a lot different than table salt. Kosher salt has this really coarse crystals, really coarse flakes. And what's really nice about kosher salt, especially on meat, it dissolves into the meat and really gets deep into the fibers. It's the perfect seasoning for cooking proteins, and in this case, also pasta. Table salt is really, really fine. It's usually used in baking and requires very little amount to get the results that you want. But in our case, when we do make pasta, and in my recipe, I like kosher salt. You do need a lot more kosher salt than you would table salt, but I feel like it definitely dissolves and blends really nicely into the dough. And I know that's kind of counterintuitive. A lot of you will think, well, hey, we're making dough. I automatically associate that with baking, so let's use table salt. We're not really baking pasta, we're kneading a dough and then we're cooking it, so I feel like kosher salt penetrates it beautifully. Finally, for my recipe, you're gonna need some olive oil. I recommend just getting some regular cooking extra virgin olive oil. I wouldn't get the really dark stuff, the stuff that's used for like salads or, as a sauce afterwards. I would use extra virgin olive oil. It's a little bit more on the lighter side that you can actually use for sauteing things. If you get the really dark stuff that's more for salads, you can get that rancid taste when you go to cook the pasta, and you may not like that. So if you don't have a pasta machine, I highly recommend you get one and check out my full review on the Imperia versus the Atlas 150. Those two machines are hands down the leading true Italian-made machines in the industry. I mean, they are both used in restaurants all over the world. I highly recommend you guys buy one. It's a great investment to keep in your kitchen. If you don't have a pasta machine, we're gonna be making fettuccine in this video. You can literally just roll out the dough and fold it and then cut really long strips for fettuccine. Your fettuccine is gonna be a little bit thicker. It's not gonna be as consistent as it would be with a pasta machine, but you'll get the same results. I highly recommend you do get one and watch my video review on the Imperia and the Atlas 150. You'll be surprised, the Imperia is very, very affordable. And then finally, obviously for the second method, you're gonna need a food processor. Any food processor will do. I'm not gonna go out there and tell you to buy the most expensive machine. My particular machine is the Cuisinart 14 cup food processor that's basically highly recommended by everybody. It's usually $250. You can find it on sale for around $150, sometimes even $100, but that's really rare. That's an amazing food processor, but whatever you have at home should be sufficient. And lastly, I get this question quite often, can you make a blender to make pasta dough? The answer is no. It just doesn't have the RPMs to kind of whip the dough and completely incorporate the ingredients together. And remember, a blender is used for beverages, for making beverages, smoothies, drinks. You can blend certain things and purify them into liquids, like for example, if you're making salsa or something like that. A food processor is just that. It processes food. So I wouldn't try it with the blender, but if you want to, knock yourself out. So that's basically the ingredients and some of the tools that you're gonna need. Now let's move on to the process. Okay, so like I said, for my recipe, I will be using 4 cups of unbleached all-purpose flour. We're gonna be using 5 whole eggs. We're gonna be using about a tablespoon of water and about 2 tablespoons of olive oil. We'll gauge that. Let's talk about the traditional all-hand approach to making pasta dough. This is the method that's been used and passed down from generation to generation. All you need is a board, your hands, a sharp knife, and maybe a roller if you don't have a pasta machine. So you're gonna go ahead and grab your 4 cups of flour, you're gonna dump it on your board, and you're gonna kind of form it into this volcano shape. You're gonna leave the middle kind of open so you can dump your eggs in there. Now, the 4 cups of flour kind of need to, form this little barrier, but don't get nervous if that breach happens and the eggs start running through. It's okay. The point of this is to just kind of have something to hold everything in place so you can start mixing the flour and eggs together. Now, this is where I like to add the salt. Now, this might sound like a lot of salt, but I think it does add a lot of flavor to the pasta. I like to add about 2 or even 3 tablespoons of kosher salt. It's entirely up to you guys if you want to add more or if you want to go a little bit less, and then salting the water as well. That's really going to make your pasta really, really rich. So right now would be a good time to add the salt. I like to crack my eggs into a separate bowl. You don't need to actually blend your eggs in the bowl. You're actually going to blend them in that volcano of flour on the board. But crack your 5 eggs and then go ahead and gently pour them into the center of your flour volcano. Just make sure you have a nice perimeter, because in the beginning you don't want a breach. You want to try to get some sort of a mixture going. If a breach happens later on as you're mixing the eggs and the flours together, that's fine, because later on, your flour is already kind of starting to form and it won't be as runny. Again, it's not the end of the world if you have a breach early on or not. I know it seems intimidating, especially if it's your first time. It just means it's gonna be a little bit more messier. That's it. Nothing bad's gonna happen. Your pasta's still gonna be really, really good. But really, the process to this method is to slowly mix your eggs in that flour volcano and to slowly incorporate flour as you're beating the eggs. You wanna kind of just grab a bit of flour and mix it into the eggs until you get a nice, decent mix, and grab a little bit more with your fork and just keep mixing it in, and do that gradually. You'll start to see the center, the volcano, forming dough. It's gonna get a little bit more stickier. It's gonna start forming, getting a little bit more clumped up. And then the more flour that you incorporate, the more of that dough that you're gonna get, the more it's gonna form. Once you feel like you're getting a really good consistent mix, then you can put the fork away and start using your hands to knead and form the dough. If you don't know what kneading dough is, it's basically the method of rolling your dough and kind of folding it over and pushing it down and kind of doing that back and forth over and over again. And what you're really doing is you're getting all those air pockets out, right? You're getting the dough to incorporate all of the ingredients, get those air pockets out, and you'll know when the kneading process is over when you have a really nice smooth surface finish on the dough on the bottom part with no cracking. If this is your first time, it's gonna be really hard to kind of tell when your dough is ready. If you've baked before, you'll probably have a good idea of what kneading dough should feel like and look like. But for those of you guys that have never done it before, I would say knead your dough for at least 20 minutes by hand. A really good way to check to see if your dough is ready, when you are done kneading it, just kind of flip it over with the smooth side now facing up to you and form it into like a little ball. I like to use the spring back method. You basically take your finger and you push down on the center of the dough. You should see the dough spring back relatively quickly. The faster it springs back, the better it's kneaded. The slower it springs back, the more kneading it needs. I would knead for another 5 or 10 more minutes. Just over kneading is always better than under kneading. As soon as you're done kneading your dough, you need to wrap it in plastic wrap almost immediately. And try to wrap it as tight as possible and then set it aside for at least an hour. You're allowing your dough to completely rest, and this will make it a lot more pliable and easier to work with. If you skip on this method, when you go to roll your dough or even put it through the pasta machine, it's gonna be really tough, really thick. You're gonna have a really hard time and it's gonna wanna separate and crack. So letting it rest, wrapped in plastic wrap, fairly tightly for at least an hour is a very crucial and critical step. Some people will tell you to go more than an hour. Some people will tell you to let it rest for 8 hours or even for a whole day. I think that's unnecessary. I think minimum an hour is good. Personally, I haven't seen any added benefits to over an hour. So I think if you do let it rest for an hour, you're in good shape. Once it's done resting, unwrap it. I like to cut my dough into sections. It's up to you how many sections you need. I usually make pasta for 2, so I'll cut it into 4 large chunk sections. For the sections you cut that you won't be using, go ahead and place those over to the side, but make sure you go ahead and wrap them as well. You don't want any air to start, penetrating the dough and kind of ruining it. You want to keep it relatively dry and covered at all times. The section that you are using, go ahead and roll it out with your roller. Get it as thin as you like your fettuccine to be. It's hard to gauge that by hand, but that's where a pasta machine comes into play. And then you're gonna go ahead and fold it, and then you're gonna go ahead and cut it long ways to get your fettuccine pasta. The length of your fettuccine pasta is entirely up to you. Some people like it really long, some people like it medium or even short. So that's completely up to you how you fold your dough and cut your dough by hand. If you have the Imperia pasta machine, the first thing you're gonna do is run the dough on the highest setting to flatten it out. Your pasta machine may be different, so the Atlas and the Imperia kind of share a different way of, dialing in the thickness of the dough. With the Imperia, the larger number is the thicker gauge of dough, right? You'll see the teeth opening up much wider, which tells you your dough is going to be much thicker. Run that through at least twice, and then dial down the thickness on your machine, again, depending on the Atlas or the Imperia. The Atlas goes from 0 onwards, so thickest being 0, and the higher numbers being thinner. The Imperia is backwards. The higher numbers are thicker, and the lower numbers are thinner. You want to go ahead and dial your pasta machine in those increments. Don't try to skip numbers, just go in sequence, and you want to slowly flatten out your dough into this nice consistent thickness. And for fettuccine, personally for me, we like to stop at around 3 or even 2 sometimes. We like the fettuccine kind of thick. We want that sauce to really get absorbed and to just kind of completely coat and get into all the pasta. So for fettuccine, setting number 3 or 2 is perfect on the Imperia. For the Atlas, I believe they recommend 6 or 7 if I remember off the top of my head. But again, it's entirely up to you and what you prefer. Okay, now let's talk about the food processor. The food processor really does speed up things a bit. Add your 4 cups of all-purpose flour into the food processor. And then you're gonna go ahead and incorporate your eggs. You're gonna go ahead and put in all 5 of your eggs. Again, you don't need to pre-mix them into a bowl. Just crack them and put them in there individually. And then put the lid on your food processor. And I like to, at first, pulse the food processor just to kind of get things going and really get those eggs completely incorporated. And then I like to put the food processor on the low setting, or if you don't have any low or high settings, just go ahead and turn it on. And then you're gonna slowly start adding in your olive oil. The olive oil essentially gets the ingredients to start playing nice with each other, and you'll start seeing your dough forming really, really quickly, really, really well. Now it's up to you if you wanna add water or not, but the water will just make it more pliable. So just kind of gauge it. I always reserve about 2 tablespoons of water on the side, and I usually incorporate that in if I feel like the pasta is just, a little bit too rough, the processor is having a hard time mixing it. Adding a bit of water really does wake things up and kind of gets the dough to be more alive. Typically speaking, you don't want to over process your dough, because then your pasta is going to come out kind of rough. It's going to be hard to use and hard to work with. I'd be concerned if your processor's on for more than 5 minutes, and you'll know when the pasta's ready because you'll see it. You'll see the color changing, incorporating. The dough will start looking kind of like grainy and kind of almost sandy, like, the sand at the beach. So that's kind of what you want to see, this nice rich color and this like sandy, pasty texture. When you're done, take everything out, put it on your cutting board, and then start kneading the dough by hand. And you'll see that it almost instantly starts working with you, right? You do not have to put that much effort into kneading it and getting it going. It's a lot faster, it's a lot quicker. Same methods apply, just keep kneading it until you get a nice smooth bottom surface, flip it over, look at it. I still do the finger spring back method just to make sure that the dough is good. And then same thing, cover it up, let it sit on your counter for at least an hour. And then after the hour, you can start slicing it into manageable pieces, and then, proceed to making your fettuccine or your spaghetti or whatever it is that you're gonna be making for that night. Now, I think I forgot to mention this for the handmade method, but still, the same rules apply. Keep about 2 tablespoons of water. You can always add a bit of water to kind of loosen up the dough and just bring in some more of that moisture. Okay, so now let's talk about storage. Storage is a big one. For most of you, you're not gonna use the entire dough that night to make pasta, unless you have a lot of guests coming over. especially for 4 cups. That's a lot of pasta. Now storage is a big deal, right? You just combined flour and eggs, so you definitely have a shelf life, or an expiration if you want to think of it that way. If you are going to be making pasta that night, great, cut your slices, cook it. If not, let's say, you were preparing this the night before, you can definitely put them in the fridge. Just make sure you cover them really tightly just to make sure everything's nicely sealed and they do have, the best opportunity to stay fresh. Your basic plastic Tupperware will be just fine, but definitely do wrap them in the plastic wrap just to kind of keep them, extra safe. You can store them in the fridge for, I would say, no more than 2 days. I think after 2 days, really, I wouldn't feel comfortable, and definitely after 3 days, I would think you're gonna get sick. So I wouldn't consume pasta that was stored in the fridge for more than 3 days. Now, if you're like me and you're gonna be saving some pieces for next week or even the week after that, I've found that when you do freeze your dough, you can probably use it for up to 4 weeks. Now, I can't really tell you for sure if it's 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 months, 4 months, whatever. But personally for me, it's always been fresh, it's been fine, it smelled good, there has been no problems. I've seen people suggest that if you do freeze your pasta dough, it's good for almost 4 months. Now, personally, I've never, ever had my dough in there for more than 6 weeks because we do eat a lot of pasta, so I can't attest to that. So that's basically your storage, your shelf life, your expiration date. If you're putting it in a fridge, no more than 3 days. Really, for me, 2 days would be my max. And if you're putting it in the freezer, I can personally attest to at least 4 to 6 weeks. Okay, now let's talk about the pros and cons of each method. Let's start off with the first method, the traditional method, using entirely your hands. Well, the first big pro is you have absolute control over the dough, and it is really, really fun to do. If it's your first time doing it, I'm sure it's going to be really stressful, but you will definitely get in the rhythm and it does become a little bit enjoyable. Now, to an extent, I don't always want to do this method. It's very tiring. Kneading that dough for 20-30 minutes can get exhausting, and oftentimes it's really, really messy. So those are the cons. For the pros, you have a lot of control. It's really fun to do, at least for your first time, and you definitely feel like you're doing something very traditional and authentic. It's also very flashy, right? So if you're having company coming over and they're seeing you, making pasta by hand using the first method, a lot of people are gonna be really impressed and they know they're gonna get a really good meal at the end of it. And you really do have to find the time to do it. I mean, it's gonna take a lot longer than the food processor method. Now let's talk about the second method, the food processor. Biggest pro is it's extremely fast. The processor does the majority of the work for you, and cleanup is much better, much faster. It's not as messy as the first method. The cons are you need a food processor, and food processors usually aren't very cheap. You can easily ruin the dough if you overdo it on the food processor, so you definitely have to keep your eye on things, and you kind of need to gauge it and really look at the dough and watch for that color change. But I feel like the pros definitely outweigh the cons because it's a lot faster, cleanup is a lot better, and it's really easy to do once you get the hang of it. Now, what about taste? What about quality? What about the final product? If you're looking for quality pasta, either method's gonna really get you good pasta, and I wouldn't really worry about one method over the other. What's gonna distinguish things is the flour that you use. I really think using 00 flour is gonna elevate your pasta dish to a whole nother level. As you guys can see here from my video, I made fettuccine, which was delicious. I've also made spaghetti, and I've used the handmade method and the food processor method, but both methods resulted in an amazing meal. So that's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative. Check out some of my other videos and follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram at TomWadeK and on Facebook, Tom Wade K Films. I use my Instagram account to kind of post behind the scenes photos and interact with you guys. I'll also post some behind the scenes photos and videos on my Facebook account, but I primarily use that to really interact with you guys and answer some of your questions. So follow me on social media and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Take care, everybody. Hey, everybody. How'd you guys like that last video? Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you get notified on my next video. And if you can, please share with your family and friends. I would really appreciate it. Here's some more content that I think you guys are really gonna enjoy. Check them out. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Take care.